Clara Bennett slammed her last 3 coins onto that counter with both hands, shaking her jaw tight, her eyes dry because she had used up every tear she owned months ago. The storekeeper counted them slow, real slow, the way a man does when he wants a room full of people to watch a woman suffer. Then he pushed 2 of them back across the wood and said the words that cracked something open inside her chest that never fully healed. "You're short, Miss Bennett. Again." If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens next will change the way you see everything. The entire general store went quiet, the way a room only goes quiet when everyone present understands they are about to witness something they will talk about for years. Clara did not move. She stood at that counter with her spine straight and her chin level and her hands flat on the worn wooden surface, and she looked at those 2 coins sitting in the groove of the wood, and she thought very clearly that she was going to be sick. Not from hunger, though the hunger was real enough. She was going to be sick from the particular kind of shame that only comes when a person realizes they have run out of options in a public place in front of people who already decided what they thought of her long before today. Harold Pitts, who had owned that store for 22 years and considered himself something of a moral authority in Dry Creek, Wyoming territory, folded his thick arms across his chest and looked at her the way a man looks at a stray dog that has wandered through his door for the 3rd time that week. He had the kind of face that had settled permanently into a shape of contempt, the kind of face that had forgotten it was ever young or uncertain or hungry. "You're 2 coins short, Miss Bennett," he said again, louder this time, because the first time had not produced quite the spectacle he seemed to want. "2 coins. You got 2 coins somewhere on your person, or you ain't taking those supplies out of my store today." Clara breathed in through her nose. She breathed out through her mouth. She had exactly 7 cents to her name. The supplies she needed, the flour, the salt pork, the small block of lard, came to 9. She had known this when she walked in. She had known it, and she had come anyway because she had told herself, riding the 4 miles down from the ridge in the thin gray light of a Wyoming winter morning, that perhaps she had miscalculated. Perhaps she had forgotten a coin in her coat pocket. Perhaps God was going to do her one small favor on this one small Tuesday. He had not. "I can bring you the rest next week," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. "I have work coming in. I'll have the money by Friday." "You said that last month." "Last month I had a setback. This month I don't." A setback. Harold Pitts unfolded his arms just long enough to pick up one of the coins and hold it up between his thick fingers, turning it as though inspecting it for flaws. "That what you're calling it? A setback." The woman standing nearest to the dry goods shelf, Martha Colby, who sang in the church choir every Sunday and had smiled at Clara's mother at her funeral 3 years ago, turned slightly away. Not fully. Just enough to make clear she was not going to be involved. The 2 men near the stove shifted their weight. A young boy who had been sweeping the floor near the back had stopped sweeping and was watching with the open curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to hide what they find interesting. "I'll take 2 of the 3 items," Clara said. "The flour and the salt pork. You keep the lard." "You want me to restock a half order?" "I want you to let me buy what I can afford." "What you can afford," Harold Pitts said, and there was something in the way he said it, something satisfied and slow, that made Clara's hands curl on the countertop. "Miss Bennett, I have run this store since before you were born. I have extended credit to people in this county more times than I can count. You know what I've learned. People who can't pay what they owe in full don't usually get better. They get worse. And then I'm the one standing here holding nothing." "I'm not asking for credit," Clara said. "I'm asking you to sell me 2 items instead of 3. I'm telling you the order was rung up together and I don't have the time to—" "Then I'll take the flour only." Her voice had gone very quiet. "Just the flour. How much is the flour?" Harold Pitts looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the room. Then he looked back at her with the expression of a man who has found something to enjoy about his morning. "You know, Miss Bennet, maybe the problem here ain't the coins. Maybe the problem here is a woman living alone on a ridge 4 miles out of town, trying to run a life she ain't equipped to run. Your father couldn't make that place work. Your mother certainly couldn't. What exactly makes you think—" "The flour," Clara said. "How much is the flour?" He told her. She looked at the 7 cents in front of her. The flour was 8. Something behind her eyes went very still. She had been 23 when her father died, and left her the small failing property on the ridge with its leaking roof and its rocky soil, and its 3 remaining chickens and its debt. She had been 24 when the first real winter came, and she lost the chickens and nearly lost 2 fingers on her left hand to frostbite, and learned that pride alone does not keep a body warm. She was 26 now, and she had spent 2 years learning in very specific and unforgiving detail exactly what she was capable of surviving. She was not someone who cried easily. She was not someone who gave up easily. But standing in Harold Pitts's general store on a Tuesday morning in January, with 7 cents and a roomful of people watching her face, Clara Bennet felt something in her chest go very close to breaking. She gathered her coins. She straightened up. She reached for the empty flour sack she had brought with her, and she began to fold it back up because she was not going to leave it on that counter for Harold Pitts to look at. She was going to take it home, and she was going to figure something out, and she was not going to let a single person in this room see her face do anything other than what it was doing right now, which was nothing, which was stone, which was fine. "You drop this." The voice came from her left. Low and even, not loud. The kind of voice that does not need to be loud, because it is already sure of itself. Clara turned. The man standing near the iron stove had not moved from where he'd been standing when she walked in. She had registered him the way she registered furniture present, not relevant. He was lean in the way that working men are lean, the kind that has nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with years of physical labor done without complaint. Dark eyes under the brim of a hat he had not removed when he came inside, which was unusual. Dark brown coat with the collar turned up. The kind of face that was not quite young and not quite old, and had clearly spent a great deal of time in weather. He was holding out a silver coin. Clara looked at it. She looked at him. She looked back at the coin. "I didn't drop anything," she said. "You did," he said. "Just now, when you came in." He kept his hand extended, palm-up coin sitting flat in the middle. His eyes were steady, and there was nothing in them she could read easily. No pity, no performance, no particular desire to be thanked. "It went under the mat. I picked it up." Everyone in the store knew she had not dropped a coin. Everyone in the store knew what he was doing. Harold Pitts's jaw tightened. He looked at the man by the stove, the way a man looks at someone who has just complicated his morning in a way he hadn't anticipated. Clara looked at the coin for 3 full seconds. Then she reached out and took it from his palm. "Thank you," she said. Her voice did not shake. She turned back to the counter and placed it next to the others and looked at Harold Pitts and said, "The flour and the salt pork." Harold Pitts rang it up without another word. She walked out of that store with her paper-wrapped supplies under one arm and the folded flour sack under the other, and she walked all the way to her horse tied at the post, before she stopped and stood with her back to the street and pressed her forehead very briefly against the horse's cold neck and breathed. Just breathed. The horse was a large gray mare named Biscuit, who was 15 years old and had belonged to her father and was the single most reliable living creature in Clara's current life. And she did not move or startle when Clara pressed against her, only shifted her weight slightly, as though to offer more of herself to lean on. "All right," Clara said quietly to the horse, or to herself, or to no one in particular. "All right." She was tying the supplies to the saddle when she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her. "Miss Bennet?" She turned. It was him, the man from the stove. He had followed her out. He had his hat in his hands, now turning it by the brim in a slow circle, the way men do when they are about to say something they have not entirely decided on yet. Up close she could see that his coat was well made, but old, repaired in several places, and that his boots were functional rather than fashionable, which told her something. His eyes were darker than she'd thought. Brown, almost black in the winter light. "I didn't catch your name," he said. "I didn't offer it." Something crossed his face. Not offense. Something closer to acknowledgement. "Fair enough. Ethan Walker. I run the outfit up past Garner's Ridge, about 9 miles north of here." She had heard the name Walker. Not often and not recently, but she'd heard it. Kept to himself mostly. Came to town infrequently. No trouble that anyone had bothered to report. "Clara Bennett," she said, because refusing it entirely would have been rude, and she was not rude when she could help it. "I know," he said. "Your father's place on the ridge." "My place." He acknowledged that with a small nod. "I wanted to say what Pitts did in there was wrong. The way he spoke to you." "Mr. Walker," Clara said, returning to her saddle ties. "I appreciate what you did, I do, but I'd rather not stand here in the street and discuss Harold Pitts or his opinions of me." "That's not why I came out," he said. He had not moved closer. He was still standing the same distance away, hat still in his hands. "I came out to offer you work." Clara's hands stilled on the leather strap. "Work," she said. "My foreman quit 3 weeks ago. Took 2 hands with him when he went. I've been managing the books alone and I'm not suited to it." He said it plainly without apology or embarrassment, the way a person states a simple fact. The livestock records are a disaster. The supply accounts are months behind. I got a supplier in Cheyenne threatening to cut me off because somebody, probably me, made an error in the last 3 invoices and I can't find it. He paused. "I heard you kept your father's accounts for years before he died. I heard you're good with numbers." "Who told you that?" "Reverend Miles. Last fall sometime. Said Clara Bennett's got more sense in her little finger than most men in this county got in their whole heads, or something to that effect." Despite everything, the corner of Clara's mouth moved. Just slightly. "He said that, something like that. I may be paraphrasing." Ethan Walker looked at her steadily. "I'm offering honest wages for honest work, Miss Bennett. Nothing more complicated than that. I need someone who can read a ledger and tell me where I went wrong. From what I understand, you can do that." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had learned in the past 3 years to be careful about the offers of men she did not know. Not because she was afraid exactly, but because she had seen enough to know that the word help rarely came without a shape to it that someone else had already decided on. "How many days a week?" she said. "Whatever works for you. 3 to start. More if it seems right." "What are you paying?" He named a figure. It was fair. It was more than fair. It was, Clara realized with a small cold shock, more than she had earned in the previous 2 months combined. She finished tying her supplies. She gathered Biscuit's reins. She put her boot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle, and looked down at Ethan Walker, standing in the frozen street with his hat in his hands and his dark eyes steady and patient, waiting without any particular anxiety for her answer. "I'll come Monday," she said. 7 in the morning. If the books are as bad as you say, we'll need the full day." "They're worse," he said. "Then I'll come at 6. And she rode north without looking back. The cold was hard and clean against her face, and the supplies were solid weight behind the saddle, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk turned slow circles against the pale sky. Clara rode, and did not let herself think too carefully about the coin, or the store, or the way Harold Pitts had looked at her, or the way Ethan Walker had not looked at her the way everyone else had. She did not let herself think about how close she had come to walking out of that store empty-handed. She did not let herself think about what she would have done if he hadn't been standing there. She thought instead about the books. About what kind of errors a man makes when he is keeping accounts he does not understand. About the supplier in Cheyenne and the 3 invoices. She thought about what it would mean to have a reliable income for the first time in 2 years, even a temporary one. She thought about Reverend Miles and what he might have said exactly, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time settle quietly into place somewhere behind her sternum. Not hope exactly. She had learned to be careful with hope. but something adjacent to it, something that felt like the beginning of a door opening. Monday morning came in dark and bitter, and Clara arrived at Ethan Walker's ranch at 6 o'clock precisely. Her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her saddlebag carrying a notebook and 2 pencils, and the small set of bookkeeping tools her father had taught her to use before she could properly ride. The ranch house was large and weathered, and clearly built by someone who knew what they were doing but had not been maintained by anyone who cared for some time. The barn needed paint. One of the fence posts on the near corral listed badly to the left. The woodpile by the back door was not properly stacked and would shed water in the first rain. Clara noted all of it the way she noted everything methodically without judgment, simply cataloging what was there and what was not. Ethan Walker answered the door before she knocked. He had clearly been up for hours. His coat was on, his boots were on, and he was holding a coffee cup with the expression of a man who has not slept well and has made his peace with it. "You're early," he said. "You said the books were worse than you thought," Clara said. "So I'm early. Where are they?" He stepped back and let her in. The ledgers were on the kitchen table, and they were in fact worse than she had imagined. 3 years of accounts in 4 different handwritings, 2 of which she was fairly certain belonged to men who had never formally learned to keep records. Numbers entered in the wrong columns, expenses catalogued as income, an entire quarter missing from the livestock register. The Cheyenne supplier error was not in the last 3 invoices, it was in the foundational account structure, a mistake made so early and so consistently that it had compounded across every subsequent entry. Clara sat down at the table without taking off her coat. She opened her notebook. She uncapped her pencil. "Do you have the original supplier contract?" she said. "I think so, somewhere." "Find it," she said. "And the last 2 years of cattle sale receipts if you have them." "I might. If you might have them, then find out now, because I need to know what I'm working with before I can tell you how long this will take and what it's going to cost you to fix." She looked up at him briefly. "Coffee first if you're offering, then the receipts." Ethan Walker looked at her for a moment with an expression she would come to recognize over the next weeks and months as the particular look of a man who has discovered that the person he hired is significantly more capable than he anticipated and is not entirely sure how to process that. He poured her coffee. He went and found the receipts. They worked until dark. Clara found the supplier error by noon and wrote Ethan a letter to send to Cheyenne that afternoon that corrected the account and prevented the cutoff. By 3 o'clock, she had reconstructed the missing livestock quarter from the sale records, and 2 ranch hand wage logs she found folded inside a copy of the Wyoming Territorial Register from 1886. By the time the light was failing, she had a complete picture of the ranch's financial position, and the picture was not as dire as the books had made it look. "It's not as bad as you thought." She told him over supper he had insisted quietly that she stay, and she had not argued because she was hungry, and the ride home in the dark was 4 miles, and she was already tired. The Cheyenne account was the main problem. That and the livestock register. Once those are corrected, your actual position is manageable. Not comfortable, but manageable. How long to get the rest in order? 2 weeks, maybe 3. 4 if the cattle sale records from 86 are as incomplete as the ones from 87. "They're worse," he said. "Then 4, she said. And then," she looked at him across the table. "And then you keep them up yourself. I can show you the system. It isn't complicated once you understand the structure." "Or," he said carefully, looking at his coffee cup rather than at her, "you could stay on, past the 4 weeks. Keep the books on an ongoing basis. The ranch could use it. I could use it." Clara considered this. Outside, the wind had come up and was working at the corners of the house with the focused energy of Wyoming in January. The lamp on the table threw everything in warm yellow and soft shadow, and somewhere in the barn a horse was moving around in its stall. "Ongoing wages," she said. "Same rate." "Same rate," he agreed. "And I keep my own hours." "Your own hours. And if I find other problems, supply contracts, grazing agreements, anything else that's costing you money, I have full authority to address them directly." He looked up at her then. "Full authority. he repeated. I'm not going to find a problem and then wait for your permission to fix it, Mr. Walker. That's not how I work. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more considered than a smile. All right, he said. Full authority. Then I'll be here Wednesday, Clara said, and pushed back from the table and put on her coat and gathered her notebook and went out into the cold to find Biscuit, who was waiting in the barn with the patience of a horse that has been through worse winters than this. She rode home in the dark with the wind behind her and the stars hard and brilliant overhead, and she did not let herself think too much about the warmth of the lamp or the steadiness of Ethan Walker's voice when he said full authority. She did not let herself think about the way the evening had felt in its particular quietness, like something she had not had in a very long time. She thought about the Cheyenne account. She thought about the 1886 cattle records. She thought about what a properly run ranch could earn in a good year and what would need to change structurally to get there. She thought about Monday and what she would do when she got there. She thought, this is something I can work with. And that for Clara Bennett, at 26 years old in the winter of 1888, riding 4 miles home in the dark after the best day she had experienced in 2 years, that was enough. That, for now, was everything. Wednesday arrived the way most important days do, without announcement, without ceremony, just gray light and cold air and the particular silence of a ranch that has too much work for one man to carry alone. Clara tied Biscuit to the post, pulled her saddlebag from behind the saddle, and walked to the front door without knocking. She had decided on the ride over that knocking was for visitors, and she was not a visitor. She was the person who was going to fix the 1886 cattle records, and people who fix things do not knock. Ethan was already in the kitchen. Coffee made lamp lit the 1886 ledger open on the table, with a look on its pages like it knew it was in trouble. The supply contract from Cheyenne, Clara said, setting her bag down and pulling out her notebook. Did you send that letter? Sent it yesterday. Good. Then today we start on the grazing agreements. She sat down and opened the ledger and did not look up. How many separate parcels are you running cattle on? 4 technically, but one of the agreements expired in '85 and nobody ever renewed it, Clara finished. So you've been grazing on land you don't have a current legal right to graze on for 3 years. Ethan sat down across from her slowly. When you say it that way, it sounds like a problem, she said. Because it is one. Who owns that parcel? He told her. She wrote it down. She asked 12 more questions in the next 4 minutes and wrote down every answer. And by the time the coffee was cold, she had a complete picture of a ranch that had been run for years by a man who was genuinely excellent at the physical work of ranching and genuinely terrible at every piece of paper that came with it. You're not stupid, she said at one point, not looking up from the ledger. You just never learned the paperwork side. Somebody should have taught you. Ethan was quiet for a moment. My father ran everything in his head, never wrote a thing down. Said paper was for people who didn't trust their own memory. Your father's memory isn't running this ranch anymore. No, Ethan said. It isn't. She looked up at him briefly. There was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not self-pity. Nothing that fragile. Something more like a man standing on a piece of ground he'd been avoiding for a long time, and finally deciding to just stand on it. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, and then looked back at the ledger. The expired grazing agreement, she said. I'll draft a renewal and you'll sign it and we'll get it filed before the end of the month. The owner, do you know him? Bill Cormack. He's got a place about 6 miles east. Are you on good terms? Good enough. Then this gets handled this week, she said. Not next week. This week. Ethan nodded. He did not argue, which she was beginning to understand was something specific about him. He did not argue about things he knew she was right about, and he did not pretend he thought she was wrong when he knew she wasn't. It was, Clara thought privately, a quality she had not encountered often enough in men to take for granted. By the end of the second week, the books were corrected. By the end of the third, Clara had renegotiated the terms on 2 of the remaining supply contracts, recovered an overpayment from a feed merchant in Casper, who had apparently been quietly overcharging the Walker Ranch for 18 months, and discovered that one of the seasonal hands had been recording double wages under 2 different names in the payroll ledger. She brought that to Ethan on a Thursday afternoon, 2 pieces of paper side by side on the table in front of him. He looked at both papers. He looked at her. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Thomas has been with me 4 years. Thomas has been billing you for a man named T. Greer, who does not exist for approximately the last 8 months, Clara said. The handwriting in both wage entries is identical. I compared it to the bunkhouse log he signs every week. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet. Something more like the particular pain of discovering that a person you trusted has been treating your trust as an opportunity. How much? She told him. It was not a catastrophic amount, but it was real, and it was deliberate, and it was months of careful, small betrayals that had clearly been intended to go unnoticed. I'll handle it, Ethan said. I know you will, Clara said. I just need you to know that when you do, I'll need updated payroll records signed by you for the last 8 months, for the Cheyenne account reconciliation. You'll have them. He picked up both papers and folded them once with the careful precision of a man who intends to do something deliberate with what's in his hands. Clara. She looked up. He almost never used her given name. He used Miss Bennett when other people were present, and he used a sort of careful nothing when they were not, just began sentences without addressing her directly, which she had come to understand as his equivalent of familiarity. This would have gone on for years if you hadn't caught it, he said. I want you to know I understand that. She held his gaze. That's what you're paying me for, she said. But something in her chest registered the words and filed them away in the place where she kept things she did not intend to examine too closely. The ranch changed in ways that were visible even to people who didn't understand books or contracts. The suppliers started delivering on time because the invoices were being paid correctly. The hands started showing up reliably because the payroll was being run properly. 2 of the grazing agreements were renegotiated at better rates. And the third parcel, the one with the expired agreement, turned out to be something Bill Cormack had been looking to offload. And Clara spent 3 evenings in January working out a purchase arrangement that gave Ethan legal ownership at a price 20% below what the land would have commanded from anyone who didn't already know its complications. How did you know he'd come down that far? Ethan asked when she showed him the final figure. Because I read the original deed before I went to talk to him, Clara said. There's an access dispute with the parcel to his north that's been unresolved since 1881. That land isn't worth full price to anyone who doesn't already border it on the south, which you do. So to Cormac, selling to you solves a problem. I just made sure he understood I already knew that before we sat down. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Where did you learn to negotiate like that? My father taught me numbers, Clara said. Life taught me the rest. February came in harder than January. The temperature dropped in ways that had even the experienced ranch hands speaking quietly about the livestock and what might need to be moved and when. Clara was at the ranch every weekday by then, and some Saturdays, and the rhythm of it had become something she did not examine, because examining it might have required her to name it, and she was not ready to do that. She knew the ranch, the way she knew her own property, the weak corner of the south barn. The water line that froze first, the 2 horses that needed to be watched in cold weather because they had a tendency toward colic. She knew which hands were reliable and which ones needed to be checked on, and which suppliers' shipments always came light and needed to be weighed before the invoice was signed. She knew all of this because she paid attention, and because paying attention had been the primary survival skill of her adult life, and because somewhere in the course of 4 weeks of daily work, she had started to feel in a way she could not precisely explain that the Walker Ranch was a place worth paying attention to. And Ethan. She knew Ethan in the particular way you come to know a person when you work alongside them daily and watch how they make decisions and what they do when things go wrong. He was not loud. He was not showy. He did not explain himself unless asked. But when he was asked, he answered plainly and without deflection, which was rarer than it should have been. He was hard on himself in the way that competent people sometimes are, holding himself to standards that the people around him would not have imposed, expecting more of himself than the situation required, carrying the weight of everything on the ranch as a personal responsibility, even when the cause was clearly outside his control. In early February, 3 days of sustained cold killed 7 head of cattle before anyone caught it. Ethan was out in it before dawn 2 days running, working alongside the hands in conditions that Clara, watching from the barn doorway, thought were genuinely dangerous for any living thing. When he came in on the second night, his hands were shaking, and he could not get the coffee cup to his mouth for a minute without steadying it on the table. Clara did not say anything about the shaking. She refilled the cup and put it where he could reach it, and went back to the record she was working on, and let him warm up in silence, which she had come to understand was what he needed when things had been bad. 7 head, he said after a while. I know, she said. I updated the livestock register this afternoon. The Cheyenne order's going to come up short now. I'll need to... I already drafted a revised order, she said. On your desk. You can look it over tonight. She paused. I also adjusted the projected quarter figures so the shortfall is documented, in case there's an insurance question. He was quiet for a long moment. She could feel him looking at her. You did all that today? This afternoon. It didn't take long once I understood the scope. Clara. He stopped, started again. I don't know what I was doing before you came. You were managing, she said without looking up from the ledger. Badly, but you were managing. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. She turned a page. You built this ranch. The physical structure of it, the herd, the land, all of that is yours. You built something real. You just needed someone to take care of the parts you couldn't see. She paused. Everyone has parts they can't see. The silence that followed was different from other silences. It had a weight to it that she was aware of but did not look directly at the way. You do not look directly at something you know will change shape the moment you acknowledge it. What are the parts you can't see? Ethan asked. His voice was quiet, genuinely curious, with no edge to it. She considered not answering. She considered deflecting the way she usually deflected personal questions, which was by asking a different question or turning back to whatever paper was in her hands. She did not deflect. I can see everything clearly when it belongs to someone else, she said. My own situation, I've always been less accurate about. Such as staying at my father's place 2 years past the point when I should have found a way to change something, she said. Such as telling myself I was managing when I was mostly just surviving. She looked up. Such as walking into Harold Pitts's store in January with 7 cents and genuinely believing I'd miscounted. Ethan looked at her steadily. You were trying. I was stubborn, she said, which is not always the same thing even when it feels like it. Something in his expression shifted, not the smile she occasionally saw, which was rare and small, and worth more than most people's loud laughter. Something deeper than that. Something she could not name, and did not try to, because the lamplight was warm, and the wind was working at the windows, and there was a pile of corrected ledgers between them, and she was not ready for anything that required a name. Same time tomorrow, she said. Same time, he said. She rode home in the dark and the cold, and she thought about the cattle and the revised order and the quarterly figures, and she did not let herself think about the warmth in the kitchen, or the steadiness of Ethan Walker's dark eyes, or the way he had said her name, like it meant something specific to him, and only him. But somewhere in March, she stopped pretending she wasn't thinking about it. March brought the first signs of a drought that none of them were prepared for. The creek that ran along the east edge of the property dropped 6 inches in 2 weeks, and the hands who'd been running cattle on the far pasture came back reporting that the grass was coming in thin and dry in places where it should have been green and thick. Ethan rode the property line 3 days in a row and came back each time with a face that was carefully arranged into something neutral, which Clara had learned meant the situation was worse than he was letting on. Tell me the actual number, she said on the third evening. What number? The number you've been calculating in your head for 3 days and haven't said out loud yet because you think saying it out loud makes it more real. He looked at her. He told her. It was not a death sentence for the ranch, but it was serious. If the spring rains didn't materialize, they would need to make decisions about the herd by early summer. How many head to sell early, which pastures to rest. How to ration the well water without losing animals to dehydration. It was a problem with no single solution. Only a series of decisions, each of which made the next decision slightly less bad. I've been through drought before, Ethan said. In '83, lost 40% of my herd. You're not losing 40% this time, Clara said. You don't know that. Not yet, she said. But I'm going to spend the next week finding out everything about this county's water rights, your neighbor's arrangements, and every option you have before we call anything a loss. You built this ranch once. You're not going to watch it die over a dry spring. She paused. Neither am I. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she felt land somewhere in her chest and stay there. Neither am I, he said quietly, like an agreement, like a promise to someone specific. She was already reaching for her notebook. The spring rains did not come. By the first week of April, it was no longer a question of whether the drought was real, it was a question of how bad it intended to be. The creek on the east edge dropped another 4 inches. 2 of the neighboring ranches had already begun selling off portions of their herds at prices that made Clara's stomach turn when she checked the Cheyenne market reports, because panic selling in a drought county does not produce fair prices. It produces desperation prices. And desperation, she had learned, was contagious. She had spent the better part of 3 weeks building a water rights map of every parcel within 12 miles of the Walker Ranch. She had ridden to the county recorder's office in Dry Creek twice the second time, with a list of 17 specific document requests that had made the clerk look at her like she had arrived from a different planet. She had read every grazing agreement, every water access easement, every creek-sharing arrangement that had been filed in Laramie County in the last 20 years. And what she had found buried in the paperwork of a filing from 1879 was something that changed the picture entirely. She brought it to Ethan on a Tuesday morning and put it on the table between the coffee cups, without saying anything first, because she had learned that he read better when she let him read without narration. He read it again. He looked up. This says the Walker property has senior water rights on the North Fork, he said. Filed by your father in 1879 before the Morrison Ranch or the Callaway operation existed, Clara said. Which means, in a shortage year, your access to the North Fork cannot be legally restricted by either of them. You have first draw. I didn't know this existed. Your father filed it, and apparently never mentioned it to anyone. She sat down. I found it between a land survey and a road easement in a box the clerk hadn't opened since 1882. Ethan looked at the document for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes, not just relief, though relief was part of it. Something larger. The particular feeling of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for so long that he has forgotten the weight was ever optional. This saves the North herd, he said. It saves more than the North herd, Clara said. It gives you leverage. Morrison and Callaway are both going to need water access arrangements before summer. You're in a position to negotiate, not beg. I don't want to negotiate hard against neighbors who are struggling. I know you don't, she said. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting you negotiate fairly from a position of strength instead of desperation, and that the arrangements you make now create relationships that will serve this ranch for the next 20 years. She paused. There's a difference between using an advantage and weaponizing one. He looked at her steadily. You draw that line real clearly. Someone has to, she said. What followed was 2 weeks of conversations that Clara conducted with the quiet precision of someone who understood that the goal was not to win, but to build something that would still be standing when the immediate crisis was over. She met with Jim Morrison on a Wednesday afternoon, and with Cal Callaway the following Friday, and both times she came back to the Walker kitchen with signed agreements, water sharing arrangements, that gave both neighbors reasonable access to the North Fork in exchange for grazing cooperation on 2 parcels that the Walker Ranch needed for summer rotation. Nobody got everything they wanted. Everybody got enough. "How does it feel?" Ethan asked when she put the second signed agreement on the table. "Like arithmetic," she said, which is all it ever was. But she was almost smiling when she said it, and he saw it, and he did not say anything about it, which was she was coming to understand its own kind of language. The drought held through April and into May, and just when the situation was beginning to feel genuinely precarious, the rains came. Not the tentative, uncertain rains of a reluctant spring real rain, 3 days of it, steady and serious. The kind that fills creeks and softens ground, and makes a rancher stand in his doorway in the early morning and breathe out something that is not quite a prayer and not quite a curse, but somewhere in between. Clara was at the ranch when it started. She was sitting at the kitchen table working through the summer supply projections when the first drops hit the window, and she did not look up immediately because she had trained herself out of reacting to things before she knew they were real. Then the drops became a sheet, and the sheet became a roar, and she looked up, and Ethan was standing in the doorway to the back of the house, looking out at the rain, with his hands loose at his sides, and his shoulders carrying something different than they usually carried, something lighter. She did not say anything. Neither did he. But she felt something shift in the room, something that had been held at a careful distance between them for months, and she looked back at her supply projections and kept writing, and did not examine what she felt, because the rain was real, and the water rights were secured, and the herd was safe, and that was enough to feel good about without reaching for anything else. She was wrong about it being enough, but she would not know that until Victor Langford arrived. She had heard the name before everyone in the county had heard the name before. Victor Langford owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, a sprawling enterprise that had been built over 30 years through a combination of genuine business acumen, aggressive acquisition, and the particular kind of legal creativity that stops just short of the things that get a man arrested. He had a lawyer in Cheyenne on permanent retainer and a judge in Laramie he had been known to dine with on a monthly basis. He was 61 years old, had been married twice, and was currently the single largest employer in the county. Nobody who depended on that employment said a word against him in public. He came to the Walker Ranch on a Thursday in late May, which Clara knew because she was there when his carriage came down the road, and Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway with a face that had gone careful, and still the way faces do when a person arrives, that you have been expecting to arrive eventually and were hoping would not. "Langford," Ethan said. "I know," Clara said without looking up. She had been reading the man's land acquisition history for the past hour and a half because 3 days earlier she had found something in the county records that she had not been looking for and that had made the back of her neck go cold in a way she had learned to take seriously. "Let him in. I'll stay in here." "You don't have to stay." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to hear the conversation without him knowing I'm hearing it. Is that a problem?" Ethan looked at her for 1 second. "No," he said, and went to answer the door. Victor Langford had the physical presence of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered, and had allowed that to become part of how he moved through the world. Not loud, not threatening, but weighty. The kind of man who sits down before he is invited to, and does not notice that he has done it. His voice carried easily through the doorway, smooth and moderate, the voice of someone who has been performing reasonableness for so long, he has forgotten it is a performance. "Ethan," he said. "Good to see you came through that drought stretch in one piece. Heard you had some trouble." "Managed through it," Ethan said. "Good, good. Listen, I'll come to the point because I know you're a busy man." A pause. The sound of a chair being pulled. "I'm looking at expanding my eastern operation. I need water access, and I need it consistent. Your North Fork rights are the cleanest senior claim in the area. I'm prepared to offer you fair market for the parcel generous, actually. This drought showed everybody how fragile things can get out here. You've got a chance to walk away with something real before the next bad year comes." Clara's hand had gone still on the page. "I'm not looking to sell," Ethan said. "I understand that feeling," Langford said. "Your father built this place. I respect that. But sentiment doesn't pay supply bills. And I've been watching your situation. You've had a rough few years, Ethan. That's not judgment. That's just the county record. My offer would clear your outstanding accounts, give you a fresh start somewhere with better land. This is my land, Ethan said. I'm not selling. A short silence. The quality of it changed slightly, something behind the reasonableness shifting like a gear catching. I want you to think about it carefully before you decide, Langford said. I'm offering this conversation as a courtesy because I've known your family a long time. The alternative approaches to acquiring that water access are more complicated, and they tend to be harder on everyone. She heard Ethan's voice go very quiet. Is that a threat, Victor? It's a description of how these things sometimes go, Langford said, and she could hear the smile in it. Think it over. I'll be in touch. He left. His carriage went back down the road. Ethan came back into the kitchen and stood at the table and looked at her, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was angry, in the deep cold way, rather than the hot way. Perfectly still, jaw-set eyes doing all the work. You heard, he said. I heard, she said. Sit down. Clara, sit down, she said. Because I need to tell you what I found 3 days ago, and I need you to be able to think clearly when I do. He sat. She had found it while cross-referencing the water rights documentation with the county land records from the previous decade. 6 separate parcels, each acquired by Langford interests in the last 8 years. Each acquisition preceded by a pattern, a bad year for the property owner, a sudden called loan, a supply contract canceled, a grazing arrangement terminated without explanation. None of it individually illegal. All of it together deliberate. A method, a system for manufacturing the conditions that made desperate people willing to sell what they would not otherwise sell. She laid it out for him piece by piece, the documents in a row across the table, her own notes alongside them. He's done this 6 times that I can document, she said. There are probably more I haven't found yet. He waits for a vulnerability drought debt, a bad season, and then he applies pressure at every point simultaneously until the owner runs out of options. The loan gets called. The supplier stops delivering. The merchant in town suddenly doesn't want the business anymore. She paused. He already started with you. The supplier issue in Cheyenne, the one that brought me here in the first place, I thought it was your bookkeeping error. But looking at the timing, Langford's operation placed a competing contract with that supplier 6 weeks before the billing problem started. Ethan was very still. You think he manufactured the billing dispute? I think it's worth asking who benefited from it, Clara said. It got your account flagged. It created financial instability at exactly the right moment. She met his eyes. He's been watching this ranch for longer than either of us knew. The silence that followed was the kind that changes a room. Not just the conversation, the whole shape of what was happening and what was at stake. What do we do? Ethan said. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a man who has trusted the right person to tell him something important and is ready to hear it. We don't panic, Clara said. We document everything. Every pressure point, every canceled contract, every called account, and we don't do it just for this ranch. She paused. Morrison has been dealing with supply issues for 4 months. Callaway's bank account in Casper got flagged for review last fall. Henderson's grazing lease got disputed out of nowhere in February. She looked at him steadily. He's not just coming for you, Ethan. He's working the whole county at once. He does it slowly enough that nobody connects the pieces because nobody is talking to each other. But you are, Ethan said. You've been talking to all of them. I've been reading their county records, she said. That's different. She paused. But it doesn't have to stay different. He looked at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that 6 ranch families each fighting alone lose, she said. I'm thinking that 6 ranch families standing on the same documented evidence with a unified legal position and a lawyer who isn't on Langford's payroll is a different situation entirely. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I'm thinking that what he's counting on is for everyone to believe they're the only one, and that stops the moment they find out they're not. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Outside somewhere on the property, one of the hands was calling to another, the ordinary sound of an ordinary afternoon on a ranch that had not yet been taken from its owner. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at her. "You do that," he said. "Go to all of them." "We do that," she said. "I'll organize the documents and build the legal framework. You know these people, you ride with them. You've worked beside them for years. They'll listen to you in a way they might not listen to me." She met his eyes. "This is both of us, or it doesn't work." Something crossed his face, then something she had not seen there before in quite that form. Not gratitude, though that was part of it. Something more specific. The look of a man who has found in the exact moment he needed it most that the person standing beside him is not only capable of what the moment requires, but is already 10 steps ahead of it, and who understands fully and without reservation what that means. "Both of us," he said. The word both sat in the room between them with a weight that neither of them acknowledged and neither of them ignored. Clara gathered the documents into a careful stack and slid them into her leather folder and stood up. "Morrison first," she said. "Tomorrow morning, if he'll see us. I'll send a note tonight." "He'll see us," Ethan said. "Good." She picked up her folder. "And Ethan." She paused. "Don't respond to Langford. Not yet. Don't refuse him in writing. Don't confirm anything. Don't give him a single piece of information about what you know or what you're planning." She looked at him steadily. "Right now, the most important thing we have is that he doesn't know what we've found." Ethan held her gaze for a moment that ran slightly longer than necessary. "You know," he said quietly. "I walked into that general store in January because I needed coffee and a box of nails." "I know," she said. "I didn't plan any of this." "Nobody plans any of this," she said. "That's not how the things that matter tend to start." She picked up her saddlebag. 6 o'clock tomorrow. Be ready to ride." She was at the door when he said her name again, and something in the way he said it, not Miss Bennett, not with the careful distance of the early weeks, just Clara, plain and direct, and made her stop with her hand on the doorframe. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." She did not turn around because if she turned around, she would have to deal with whatever was on her face right now, and she was not ready for that particular conversation yet. "Tomorrow," she said, 6 o'clock. She rode home in the long light of a May evening with the folder of documents in her saddlebag and the list of names already organizing itself in her mind. Morrison, Calloway, Henderson, the Briar Creek family, the 2 operations out past the old mill road, and she told herself she was thinking about the case, and the evidence, and the legal framework, and what kind of lawyer in Cheyenne would take on Victor Langford. She was thinking about all of that. She was also thinking about the way her name sounded when Ethan Walker said it like it was the only word in the sentence that mattered. She rode harder and did not slow down until she was home. Jim Morrison opened his door on a Friday morning with the expression of a man who has been sleeping badly and knows exactly why. He looked at Ethan first, then at Clara, then at the leather folder under her arm, and something in his face shifted from wariness to something closer to desperate, hungry attention. "Come in," he said before either of them had spoken a word. His kitchen table was already covered in papers, bills, letters, a notice from his bank in Casper, with a red stamp in the upper corner that Clara recognized from 12 feet away as an account review flag. She had seen that exact stamp on a document in the county records 2 weeks ago. She set her folder on the edge of the table and opened it without preamble. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "how long has your flower supplier been late on deliveries?" He stared at her. 4 months. "How did you... and your Casper account? When did the review flag appear?" "Last October." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "I thought it was a banking error. I've been trying to get it resolved since..." "It's not a banking error," Clara said. She put the first document in front of him, then the second, then the third. She walked him through every piece the way she had walked Ethan through it methodically, without drama. because the facts themselves were dramatic enough, and she had learned long ago that the most devastating truths land hardest when delivered quietly. Morrison said nothing for a long time. He turned each page, carefully reading. His jaw tightened progressively with each one, and by the time Clara reached the sixth document, the pattern of prior acquisitions, the names of the 6 ranches that had sold under pressure in the previous 8 years. He put both hands flat on the table and looked up at her with eyes that were angry and frightened in equal measure. "He's been doing this for years," Morrison said. "Yes," Clara said. "And nobody was looking at all of it together," she said. "Each family thought they were dealing with their own bad luck. Supply problems, banking issues, a canceled contract here, a lease dispute there. None of it looks like a pattern until you put it all in one room." Morrison looked at Ethan. "You knew about this?" "Clara found it," Ethan said simply. 3 days ago. Morrison was quiet. "Then, what do? We start with the others," Clara said. "Calloway Henderson, the Briar Creek operation, the Millers out past the old mill road. Every family in this county that Langford has been working against. We bring them the same documents, we get them in the same room, and we build a unified legal case." She paused. "Alone, each of you is a single complaint against the most powerful man in 3 counties, and no lawyer in Wyoming will touch it. Together, you're 6 documented victims of a systematic scheme to defraud landowners of their property rights. That's a different case entirely." "You think a lawyer will take that on?" Morrison asked. "Against Langford?" "I know one who will," Clara said. "There's a firm in Cheyenne, Hargrove and Associates. They took on the railroad land grab case in '84. Won it. They're not on Langford's payroll, and they have the resources to fight a long case." She looked at him steadily. "But they need what I've built here. The documentation, the pattern evidence, the paper trail. Without that, there's nothing to take to court." Morrison looked at the documents again. Something was happening in his face, the particular process of a man rebuilding himself from the inside out. Taking something he had been carrying alone and catastrophically, and finding out it has a different shape when it has a name and a cause and a direction. "I'll talk to Calloway today," he said. "He's been in worse shape than me. His wife's been talking about selling since March." "Tell him to wait," Clara said. "Tell him we have something. Don't explain the details on the road. Bring him to the Walker Ranch Saturday morning." She closed her folder. "And Mr. Morrison, don't say Langford's name to anyone between now and then. Don't give him any sign that anything has changed." Morrison looked at her with something that was not quite awe and not quite relief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he meant it the way men mean things when they have just realized they are no longer alone. They had 5 families at the Walker Ranch by Saturday afternoon. 6, counting Ethan. Clara had spent Friday night at her own property, organizing the full documentation package into 6 identical sets, writing by lamplight until past midnight, her hand cramping around the pencil in a way she ignored because there was no time to stop. She had ridden to the Walker Ranch in the early morning dark with the sets stacked in her saddlebag, and by the time the families started arriving, she had everything laid out on the long table Ethan had moved from the barn. She watched them come, in Morrison and his wife Calloway, with his jaw set and his eyes carrying weeks of bad sleep. The Henderson brothers who ran their father's old operation together and had been arguing about whether to sell. Since February, the Briar Creek family, whose patriarch said almost nothing, but whose hands Clara noticed stopped shaking for the first time all morning when he finished reading the pattern document. The Millers came last, young couple, married 4 years. Their first real ranch, their faces carrying the particular terror of people who have not yet had enough hard years to know for certain that they can survive one this bad. Clara stood at the head of the table and did not waste time. She put the evidence in front of them in the order she had organized it, the pattern first, the individual documentation, second, the legal framework, third. She spoke the way she worked, clearly, directly, without softening anything that didn't need softening, and without dramatizing anything that was already dramatic on its own. She watched their faces as she talked. She watched the anger rise and the fear reorganize itself into something more useful, and the isolation break down in real time, as each person in the room understood fully, and for the first time, that what had happened to them had happened to everyone else in the room too. When she finished, the silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then everybody talked at once. She let it run for 2 minutes. Then she said clearly, but without raising her voice, "Stop." And they did, because she had already established in the previous 40 minutes that she was the person in the room who knew what she was talking about, and they all knew it. "I understand you're angry," she said. "You should be. But anger doesn't win this case. Documentation wins this case. Legal standing wins this case. So I need each of you to go home tonight and find every piece of paper connected to every problem you've had in the last 2 years, supplier letters, bank notices, canceled, contracts, lease disputes, anything, and bring it back here Tuesday morning. Because I need to know if there is anything in your individual situations that my county record search didn't find." She paused. "If there is, it makes our case stronger. If there isn't, it still confirms what we already have." "And the lawyer?" Calloway asked. "This Hargrove firm. They'll actually take this—" "I'm writing to them tonight," Clara said. "I'll have a response within 2 weeks. But I want our documentation complete before they see it, because the strength of what we have is the completeness of it. I want them to open that package and see something that is already 90% of the case they need to make. That's how you get a firm like Hargrove to say yes." Young Mrs. Miller raised her hand slightly, a reflex from a school she had probably attended not long ago. "Miss Bennett, what happens if Langford finds out before we're ready? He's got people all over this county." "He'll find out eventually," Clara said. "That's unavoidable. The goal is to be far enough along before he does that it doesn't matter. Once this case is in the hands of a Cheyenne law firm with full documentation, Langford's leverage disappears. He can't pressure a lawyer. He can't cancel a law firm's supply contracts." She looked around the table. "He has power over people who are isolated and afraid. He has no power over people who are standing together with evidence in their hands." She saw Ethan watching her from the far end of the table. She did not look at him long enough to read his expression, because she needed to stay focused, and his expression, in this particular moment, was the kind of thing that made focus difficult. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, there were 6 signed agreements to cooperate a scheduled Tuesday meeting, and something that had not existed in that room when the day started, a shared sense of direction, which is the single most powerful antidote to despair that Clara had ever encountered. The families left in the long light of a May afternoon. Ethan walked the last of them to the road and came back to the kitchen where Clara was reorganizing the documentation stack, and found her with both hands pressed flat on the table and her head down and her shoulders carrying very visibly for approximately 3 seconds before she noticed him, everything she had been holding back for the past 48 hours. She straightened immediately. "The Tuesday meeting needs to start at 7, she said. "If they're bringing additional documents, I need time to—" "Clara," he said. She kept organizing papers. "Clara, stop." She stopped. She did not look at him. "You haven't slept," he said. "I slept Tuesday. It's Saturday. I'm aware of what day it is, Ethan." He came around the table and put himself in her line of sight, which required her to either look at him or make an obvious effort to avoid it, and she was too tired for obvious efforts. She looked at him. His face was doing the thing she had no name for, the thing that had been happening with increasing frequency over the past weeks. The thing that lived somewhere between gratitude and something she was not ready to call what it was. "What you did today," he said. "What you built. Those people walked in here ready to lose everything, and they walked out with something to fight with." He paused. "You did that." "We did that," she said. "Your name opened those doors. They came because they trust you. They stayed because of you." He was very close now, closer than the working distance they maintained during ordinary days. "I've watched you for 5 months, Clara Bennett. I've watched you work harder and think faster and care more about this county's people than most men I know care about their own families." He stopped. Something shifted in his voice. "I've been trying to find the right time to say something, and I keep not finding it." So I'm just going to say it. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. I don't want you to leave when the case is done, he said. I don't want you to take your notebooks and your ledgers and ride back to that ridge and become someone I see on supply days if I'm lucky. His voice was steady and direct and carried absolutely no performance in it, just a man saying a true thing and meaning it down to the floor. I want you here, with me, properly, if you're willing. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the coin. She thought about Harold Pitts's store and the 7 cents in the floor she had almost broken through. She thought about 5 months of early mornings and late evenings, and the 1886 cattle records, and the Cheyenne supplier, and Thomas's double wage entries, and water rights and drought, and the Langford documents spread across a table while 6 families learned they were not alone. She thought about the way she had felt riding home through Wyoming winters and springs, with the sense that she was riding toward something rather than away from it. I have conditions, she said. Something in his face moved. Name them. My work stays my own. Whatever I build, whatever systems I set up, whatever decisions I make about books and contracts and agreements, I make them. Not as your employee and not as your wife who helps out. As a partner with equal standing in every business decision this ranch makes. She held his eyes. That's not negotiable. It never crossed my mind to negotiate it, he said. And my property on the ridge stays mine. I'm not giving up the land. I wouldn't ask you to. And if I decide something is wrong, she said, I say so. Out loud. In front of other people if that's where we are when I figure it out. I don't soften things because they're inconvenient. Clara, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way that it did when he was as close to laughing as he ever got. I have never once in 5 months had the impression that you were going to start softening things. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, yes. Just that. One word. But it landed in the room like something that had been a long time in the air finally touching ground. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any of the performance that the gesture might have carried in other people's stories. Just took it the way you take hold of something real and solid that you intend to keep. His hand was warm and certain, and she did not pull away. Tuesday, she said after a moment. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, he agreed. She rode home in the late May light with her saddlebag empty of documents for the first time in 2 weeks, and something in her chest that was not cautious, and not careful, and not adjacent to anything. It was the real thing, uncomplicated and certain, and she let herself feel it all the way home without pulling back from it once. The letter to Hargrove and Associates went out Monday morning. Clara wrote it at her own table before dawn, sitting with the lamp and her best paper, and she wrote it the way she built everything with precision and confidence, and the detailed documented argument of someone who already knows the answer and is simply showing the work. She included the pattern evidence, the 6-family summary, the acquisition timeline, and a clear legal theory of the scheme. She sealed it and addressed it and wrote it to the Dry Creek post office herself and handed it to the postmaster and rode away without watching him take it inside, because she had learned that watching the thing leave your hands does not change what happens next. What happens next depends on what you built before you let go. The response came 11 days later. Clara was at the Walker Ranch working through the Henderson brothers' additional documentation when Ethan came in from the road with a letter in his hand and a look on his face she read in the first second. Hargrove, he said. She put down her pencil. She opened it. She read it once, then again. Then she put it flat on the table and pressed both hands on either side of it and looked at it and felt something move through her that she did not immediately have language for. Well, Ethan said. They're taking the case, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. They want to meet in Cheyenne in 2 weeks. They want me to bring the full documentation and be prepared to walk them through the legal theory. She paused. They said, and I'm reading directly here, the pattern evidence you have assembled represents some of the most thorough preliminary documentation this firm has received in a case of this type. She looked up at him. They're going to file. The sound Ethan made was not a shout and not exactly a laugh. It was the sound of a man who has been holding his breath for months and has finally been told it is safe to breathe. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she stood up from the table, and he put his arms around her, and she let him because she was tired, and the thing she had been building for months had just been told by people who knew what they were looking at, that it was real and solid and enough. She stood in the circle of his arms and felt the relief move through her, like water through dry ground, filling every place that had been empty and cracked and waiting. And she did not pull away, and she did not say anything practical or redirecting or professionally appropriate. She just stood there, and that was enough. 2 more weeks, she said into his shoulder after a while. 2 more weeks, he agreed. She pulled back, picked up the letter, read it a 3rd time. I need to notify all 6 families today, she said. And I need to start preparing the Cheyenne presentation. The full documentation package organized for a legal audience, which is different from Clara, he said. What I built for Saturday because lawyers read evidence differently than ranchers do, and I need to anticipate their Clara. She stopped. It's all right, he said. To just be glad for a minute, before the next thing starts. She looked at him. She breathed in. She breathed out. She let herself be glad fully, without condition, without the instinct to immediately redirect it into the next task for exactly 1 minute. Then she picked up her pencil. 6 families, she said. And then the Cheyenne presentation. He was already pouring the coffee. The Cheyenne meeting lasted 2 days. Clara had never been in a room with lawyers before. Not real ones, not the kind who worked out of offices with their names on the door and rows of casebooks behind glass, and the particular air of men who had spent decades learning how to be formidable in ways that did not require raising their voices. She had been slightly prepared for condescension. She had not been prepared for the way Samuel Hargrove, senior partner 60 years old with white hair, and the careful eyes of a man who has read 50 years of human dishonesty across courtroom tables, looked at her documentation package for 40 minutes in complete silence, and then looked up at her and said without preamble, "Who taught you to build a case like this?" "Nobody," Clara said. "I just followed the numbers until they told me something." Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he looked back at Clara. "Miss Bennett, in 30 years of practice, I have received preliminary documentation from professional investigators that was not this organized." He tapped the package. "This is a complete evidentiary trail. The pattern evidence alone would take my associates 2 months to assemble. You did it in 3 weeks. 2.5, Clara said. And I had the county records already partially organized from the water rights work." Ethan, sitting beside her, said nothing. But she felt the particular quality of his silence, which was the silence of a man who is proud of someone and is being careful not to make it embarrassing. Hargrove and his associate went through every document. They asked questions, precise technical questions about chain of custody and filing dates and the specific language of the supplier contracts, and Clara answered everyone without consulting her notes because she had built the thing herself and knew every corner of it. By the end of the 2nd afternoon, Hargrove had committed the firm to the case in full, outlined a legal strategy that would file on behalf of all 6 families simultaneously to prevent Langford from isolating and pressuring individual plaintiffs, and told Clara that he wanted her available by post throughout the proceedings because she understood the evidence better than anyone else in the room. "You'll be compensated for your time," Hargrove said. "Consulting rate. This firm doesn't take expert knowledge without paying for it." Clara had not expected that. She kept her face neutral. "That's acceptable," she said. On the ride back from Cheyenne with the Wyoming evening opening up wide on either side of the road, Ethan said, "Expert knowledge." "Don't," Clara said. "I'm just noting." "I know what you're noting, and I'd rather you didn't." He was quiet for about 30 seconds. "You're going to have to get better at accepting the things you've earned, Clara." She looked at the road ahead. "One thing at a time," she said. He did not push it, but she felt him smiling, which was worse. Langford made his first aggressive move 2 weeks after the filing was submitted. It was not subtle. A notice arrived at the Walker Ranch informing Ethan that the grazing arrangement on the shared boundary parcel, an arrangement that had existed for 9 years and had never been formally disputed, was being challenged on the grounds of a boundary survey discrepancy filed in Laramie County that week. At approximately the same time, Morrison's flour supplier in Denver canceled his standing order without explanation. Calloway received a letter from his bank informing him that his credit terms were under review. Henderson's fence line on the east pasture was cut in 2 places overnight. Clara got word of all of it within 48 hours, because the 6 families were talking to each other now, in ways they had not talked before, and information moved between them with a speed that Langford had clearly not anticipated. She was at the Walker kitchen table by 6 in the morning, the day after the fence cutting, with Morrison and Calloway already there, having ridden through the dark to compare notes. She listened to each account. She wrote everything down. Then she looked at the room. "He's escalating because the filing scared him," she said. "This is not strength. This is a man who has found out that people he expected to be isolated are not isolated, and he is throwing everything at once, hoping someone breaks before the case gets to the judge." She looked at Calloway. "Your credit review. Do you have enough reserves to operate for 60 days without that line?" "Barely," Calloway said. "Then we need 60 days, she said. "I'm writing to Hargrove today about the grazing challenge. It's a retaliatory filing, and he needs to know about it immediately. The fence cutting is criminal damage, and Henderson needs to report it to the county sheriff today in writing with a witness. Not because the sheriff will necessarily act, but because we need it on record." She paused. "Every single thing Langford does from this point forward goes into the documentation. Every letter, every canceled contract, every suspicious incident. He is building our retaliation case for us every time he moves." Morrison leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who has just understood something for the first time. "He doesn't know that." "No," Clara said. "He doesn't. Because he has never dealt with someone who was documenting him in real time." The next 8 weeks were the hardest of Clara's life, and also in a way she would only understand clearly much later, the most important. Langford pressed on every front simultaneously. 2 merchants in Dry Creek stopped extending credit to the cooperative families. She organized a group purchasing arrangement through a supplier in Laramie instead, which was actually cheaper. A water engineer appeared on the North Fork parcel, claiming to be conducting a county survey. She met him at the property line with the original 1879 water rights document and asked him to show her his county authorization, which he could not produce because there was none. A rumor began circulating in Dry Creek that Ethan Walker was facing insolvency. She walked into Harold Pitts's general store on a Tuesday morning, which was the rumor's apparent origin point, and corrected the financial record in front of 6 customers with the same quiet directness she brought to everything. And the rumor died within the week. She did not sleep enough. She rode more miles than she counted. She wrote more letters than her hand wanted to write, and had more conversations than her natural preference for silence would have chosen. She held 3 more meetings at the Walker Ranch, and 2 at the Morrison property, and 1 at the Henderson brothers' barn, because the Hendersons' mother was ill and could not be left, and she brought the documents to them rather than waiting for them to come to her. Ethan was beside her for all of it, not managing her, not directing her, but present in the specific way that she had come to understand was his way of saying that he was not going anywhere and she was not carrying this alone. He rode with her to the difficult meetings. He handled the physical disruptions. The fence repairs the water line, issues the boundary marking after the grazing challenge, so that she did not have to split her attention between the legal work and the physical work of keeping a ranch running under pressure. He fed her regularly, and without comment, because she had a tendency to forget that she had not eaten when she was deep in documents, and he had apparently decided that this was his problem to solve. One evening in late July, after a particularly brutal day that had included a threatening letter from Langford's Cheyenne lawyer and a 2-hour conversation with Hargrove about the legal response and a fence dispute at the Briar Creek property that required her physical presence, Clara sat at the Walker kitchen table with her head in her hands and said to no one in particular, "I am so tired." Ethan put a plate in front of her. He sat down across from her. "I know," he said. "He's not going to stop," she said. Even if he knows he can't win in court, he's going to keep pressing because the pressing itself is the point. He wants us exhausted. He wants somebody to break. Nobody's breaking, Ethan said. How do you know? Because I know these people, he said. Morrison's been through worse than this and stayed. Calloway has been fighting something his whole life. This is just the first time it has a name and a face. The Hendersons are stubborn past the point of reason, which in this case is actually useful. He paused. And you are the least breakable person I have ever known. Clara looked at him from under the weight of the day. I'm very tired, Ethan. I know, he said again. Eat, then sleep. The documents will still be there in the morning. She ate. She slept in the small room off the kitchen that had become by unspoken agreement the place she stayed when the work ran past dark, and the ride home was unreasonable. And in the morning, the documents were still there, and she was still there, and Langford had not broken anyone overnight, and the case was still moving forward. The ruling came on a Thursday in September. Hargrove sent a writer from Cheyenne because he said it was not the kind of news that should arrive in a letter. Clara was at the Wachter Ranch. She had been there since 6 in the morning, working on a final document reconciliation that Hargrove had requested for the post-ruling proceedings. She heard the writer come down the road and watched Ethan go out to meet him from the kitchen window. And she made herself continue working because she had learned that watching for things does not make them arrive faster and does not change what they are when they get there. Ethan came back in. He stood in the kitchen doorway. His face was doing something she had never seen it do before. Tell me, she said. Langford lost, he said. Full ruling. The judge found systematic fraud in the land acquisition pattern. The 6 contested accounts are cleared. The grazing challenges are dismissed. He stopped. His voice, which was not a voice that broke easily, was doing something at its edges. Hargrove says the ruling establishes a legal precedent for the territory. He says your documentation was cited 4 times in the judge's written opinion. Clara put down her pencil. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She looked at the wood grain of the surface, and she breathed in and breathed out, and she did not for once redirect immediately into the next task. 4 times, she said. 4 times, Ethan said. She stood up. She walked to him in the doorway, and he opened his arms, and she walked into them, and they stood there in the kitchen of the ranch she had fixed and saved and fought for, and she let herself feel the full weight and the full relief of it, without holding any of it back. We have to tell the others, she said after a while into his shoulder. I already sent a hand to Morrison, he said. He'll ride to Calloway. They'll get word to everyone by nightfall. She pulled back. She looked at him. You planned ahead. I learned from the best, he said. They were married in October in the small church in Dry Creek, with 6 ranch families in the pews, and Reverend Miles officiating, and Clara in her mother's altered dress, and Ethan in a coat he had clearly pressed for the first time in several years. Harold Pitts was not present. Nobody had invited him, and nobody had noticed the absence until Clara mentioned it to Ethan on the walk to the church, and Ethan had said simply, "Good," and she had agreed. The wedding was not elaborate. It was honest, which Clara had come to understand was worth more than elaborate in any currency that mattered. When Reverend Miles asked Ethan if he would stand beside this woman as partner and equal in all things, Ethan said yes without hesitation and looked at Clara the way he had been looking at her for months, directly, completely, with nothing held in reserve. She said yes back, to the question and to everything it carried. Their daughter Grace was born the following August, in the same house where Clara had first reorganized the ledgers that terrible January. She arrived loudly, and with strong opinions, which Ethan said was genetically inevitable, and Clara did not argue with. Grace had her mother's dark eyes, and her father's stubborn jaw, and from the very beginning, the particular quality of a person who intends to understand how everything works before she decides what to do about it. Clara watched her daughter grow up on a ranch that was healthy and solvent, and surrounded by people who had fought for their land and kept it, and she taught her the numbers the same way her father had taught her at the kitchen table, with real ledgers and real accounts. with the principle that understanding how things work is not a special talent, but a skill that belongs to anyone willing to learn it. The Frontier Academy came later, 5 years after the ruling, after a dozen women had sought Clara out individually, asking for help with accounts and contracts and letters to suppliers and legal documents they didn't understand. She formalized what she had been doing informally, found a building in Dry Creek that the cooperative families helped her purchase, hired 2 instructors, and set up the curriculum herself. Bookkeeping, contract law, business correspondence, land rights, water agreements. Everything she had learned the hard way, taught the easier way. The first year, 11 women enrolled. The third year, 34. By the 5th year, women were coming from 2 counties away, and Clara had added a lending library of legal and business references and a placement service that connected graduates with ranches and businesses looking for reliable bookkeepers and managers. Ethan attended every opening ceremony. He sat in the back row and did not speak unless spoken to, and watched his wife stand at the front of the room with her ledger and her clarity and her absolute refusal to make any of this seem like more than it was, which was simply knowledge being passed from one person to another, which was simply the ordinary work of building something that outlasts you. One evening in the autumn of their 12th year, after Grace had left for the university in the East, full scholarship, the letter had said exceptional aptitude for law and economics, which had made Clara press her lips together and look at the ceiling for a moment. Ethan came in from the barn and set a small wooden box on the kitchen table. Clara looked at it. "What is this?" "Open it," he said. She opened it. Inside, sitting on a fold of cloth, was a silver coin. Old, worn at the edges, with the particular dullness of something that has been handled many times over many years. She picked it up. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You kept it," she said. "I kept it," he said. She turned the coin over in her fingers. It was heavier than she remembered and lighter than everything it had carried. She thought about Harold Pitt's store and the 2 coins he had pushed back across the counter, and the silence of a room full of people watching a woman run out of options. She thought about a man she had not yet known, standing near a stove, holding out his hand, with something in it that was not just a coin. "Why?" she said. Ethan sat down across from her. "Because I wanted to remember what it felt like to do the right thing," he said, "before I knew what it would become, when it was just a woman who needed a way to keep her dignity and a man who happened to have a coin." He paused. "I didn't know it was going to be everything. I just knew it was the right thing." Clara held the coin. She thought about the word dignity and what it had cost her to keep it and what it had been worth. She thought about the 6 families who still had their land and the 34 women who had learned last year that numbers are not mysterious, and the daughter who was 3 days' ride east reading law books and building a future Clara could not fully imagine and could not wait to see. She thought about everything that had started with a single act of decency in a cold room, offered without expectation, accepted without full understanding of what it meant to accept it. She closed her hand around the coin. "It was always going to be everything," she said. "It just took us a while to see it." The sun went down over Wyoming the way it always did, without asking permission, without ceremony, painting the whole wide sky in colors that had no names good enough for them. Inside the kitchen, the lamp was lit, and the coffee was hot, and the ledgers on the shelf were straight and organized and bore the handwriting of a woman who had started with nothing and built something that would still be standing when she was gone. Clara Bennett Walker set the coin on the table between them, where both of them could see it. One coin. One choice. One life that became 2, that became a family, that became a community, that became a legacy, written in the records of 6 ranches and the skills of hundreds of women, and the legal precedent of a territory that had finally been shown what fairness looked like when someone refused to stop believing it was possible. You do not have to change the entire world. You only have to change one thing in one moment for one person who is standing in front of you with everything on the line. The rest, all the rest of it, takes care of itself.